Sherlock Holmes, released in 2009 and directed by Guy Ritchie, presented one of the most energetic modern interpretations of Arthur Conan Doyle's legendary detective. A major reason for the film's success was its cast, led by Robert Downey Jr., Jude Law, Rachel McAdams, and Mark Strong. Rather than treating the characters as distant Victorian icons, the actors gave them humor, physicality, flaws, and complicated personal relationships. Their performances helped transform what could have been a conventional period mystery into a fast-moving combination of detective story, action film, comedy, and character drama. Robert Downey Jr. plays Sherlock Holmes, bringing an unusual mixture of intelligence, arrogance, eccentricity, physical ability, and self-destructive behavior to the detective. By 2009, Downey was already an experienced actor whose career had gone through extraordinary changes. During the 1980s and early 1990s, he appeared in films including Less Than Zero and Chaplin. His performance as Charlie Chaplin earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor and demonstrated his ability to combine comedy, physical performance, and dramatic emotion. Personal difficulties later damaged his career, but during the 2000s he gradually rebuilt his reputation through films such as Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and Zodiac. Then came Iron Man in 2008. Tony Stark turned Downey into an international blockbuster star, and Sherlock Holmes arrived while that transformation was still taking place. His Holmes shared some qualities with Stark, particularly rapid intelligence, confidence, sarcasm, and a tendency to irritate everyone around him. However, Downey avoided simply repeating the same performance. His Holmes is more socially isolated and emotionally strange. He can solve extraordinarily complicated problems while struggling with ordinary human relationships. Downey also emphasized Holmes as a physical character. Before fights, Holmes sometimes mentally calculates exactly how he will defeat an opponent. The audience sees his planned sequence of attacks before watching him execute it. This technique connects his famous powers of deduction with physical combat. His mind does not stop analyzing simply because the problem has become violent. Downey trained extensively for the role, and his compact, restless physical performance makes Holmes appear as though his brain and body are constantly operating faster than the world around him. The performance proved extremely successful. Downey won the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Motion Picture Musical or Comedy, strengthening his return to the highest level of Hollywood stardom. Together with Iron Man, Sherlock Holmes demonstrated that he could carry more than one major franchise. Holmes became another defining character of this stage of his career and confirmed that audiences were willing to follow him into very different cinematic worlds. Jude Law plays Dr. John Watson, and his interpretation was equally important because the film depends heavily on the relationship between Holmes and Watson. Earlier screen versions sometimes portrayed Watson mainly as a friendly assistant who existed to admire Holmes. Law's Watson is very different. He is intelligent, disciplined, courageous, medically trained, and perfectly capable of confronting Holmes when necessary. He feels like a genuine partner rather than a subordinate. Before Sherlock Holmes, Law had already built an impressive international career. His work included The Talented Mr. Ripley, for which he received an Academy Award nomination, as well as Cold Mountain, which brought another nomination. He had also appeared in films such as Gattaca, Enemy at the Gates, Road to Perdition, Closer, The Holiday, and The Aviator. These roles established him as an actor capable of moving between romantic drama, historical films, science fiction, thrillers, and major studio productions. Law brought authority and restraint to Watson. His military background is important, and Law plays him as a man accustomed to danger rather than someone shocked whenever Holmes enters a violent situation. At the same time, Watson desperately wants a more stable life. His engagement to Mary Morstan represents the possibility of escaping the chaos surrounding Holmes. This creates one of the film's central emotional conflicts. Holmes depends on Watson but has difficulty admitting it, while Watson cares deeply about Holmes but knows that remaining permanently attached to him may prevent him from building his own future. Their arguments provide much of the film's humor. Downey and Law developed a fast conversational rhythm that often makes Holmes and Watson sound like an old married couple. They criticize each other, interrupt each other, and understand weaknesses that nobody else can see. Beneath the comedy is genuine affection. The film succeeds because the audience believes that these two men have survived years of adventures together. Rachel McAdams plays Irene Adler, one of the few people capable of challenging Holmes intellectually and emotionally. McAdams was already widely recognized through films including Mean Girls, The Notebook, Wedding Crashers, and Red Eye. Those performances demonstrated considerable range. She could play comedy, romance, vulnerability, manipulation, and suspense, qualities that became useful when portraying Irene. Irene Adler is not simply a romantic interest. She is clever, independent, deceptive, and dangerous. Holmes cannot easily predict her because his personal feelings interfere with the cold logic he normally applies to everyone else. McAdams gives Irene charm without making her harmless. Her presence also expands the mystery by connecting Holmes to a larger unseen threat, eventually revealed to involve Professor Moriarty. The role helped McAdams continue moving between romantic films and large-scale studio productions while demonstrating that she could comfortably inhabit an action-oriented period adventure. Mark Strong portrays Lord Henry Blackwood, the film's primary villain. Before appearing in Sherlock Holmes, Strong had become known for intense supporting performances in films including Serena, Stardust, Rock'n'Roller, and Body of Lies. His controlled voice and intimidating screen presence made him particularly effective as antagonists and authority figures. Sherlock Holmes arrived in 2009 at an important moment for both blockbuster cinema and the long history of Arthur Conan Doyle's detective. Holmes was already one of the most recognizable fictional characters ever created, with countless adaptations in film, television, radio, theater, and literature. Guy Ritchie's film did not introduce Sherlock Holmes to popular culture, but it significantly changed how a new generation imagined him. Instead of presenting Holmes primarily as a quiet Victorian intellectual, the movie transformed him into an eccentric, physically capable, emotionally complicated action hero without abandoning his famous powers of observation and deduction. This reinvention reflected a wider change taking place in popular cinema. During the late 2000s, Hollywood increasingly searched for established characters that could be reconstructed for modern blockbuster audiences. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight had demonstrated how familiar characters could be redesigned through darker characterization and contemporary filmmaking. Casino Royale had similarly reinvented James Bond. Sherlock Holmes applied that philosophy to 19th-century literature. The film respected the historical setting, but refused to behave like a traditional literary adaptation. Robert Downey Jr.'s performance became central to this cultural transformation. For decades, the popular image of Holmes had often been associated with elegant posture, controlled speech, a deerstalker hat, and a pipe. Some of these elements were themselves products of earlier adaptations rather than strict representations of Conan Doyle's stories. The 2009 movie challenged that familiar image. Downey's Holmes was untidy, restless, sarcastic, occasionally childish, and capable of brutal hand-to-hand combat. His intelligence remained extraordinary, but his behavior was unpredictable. One of the movie's most influential ideas was the visualization of Holmes's thought process during combat. Before attacking an opponent, Holmes mentally examines weaknesses, predicts reactions, calculates the sequence of strikes, and then performs the attack almost exactly as imagined. These sequences gave cinematic form to deduction itself. Instead of merely having Holmes explain his reasoning after an event, the audience was allowed to experience his analytical mind in motion. This approach became one of the film's most recognizable stylistic signatures. It also helped redefine Holmes as someone whose intelligence could function during action scenes rather than existing separately from them. The detective's greatest weapon remained his mind, but the movie demonstrated that observation could be applied to fighting as effectively as it could be applied to fingerprints, footprints, chemicals, or criminal motives. The relationship between Holmes and Watson also influenced modern perceptions of the characters. Jude Law's Watson was far removed from the stereotype of the confused companion who exists mainly so Holmes can explain the mystery to someone. He was a soldier, doctor, marksman, an experienced adventurer. He could fight alongside Holmes and frequently appeared more emotionally mature than his friend. Their friendship became the emotional center of the movie. Their constant arguments, Insults, loyalty, and dependence created a partnership that audiences could understand even without knowing the original stories. The humor surrounding their relationship also became an important part of later popular discussion of Holmes and Watson. Fans frequently interpreted their disagreements as resembling those of a married couple, while promotional material emphasized the chemistry between Downey and Law. The film appeared during a broader revival of interest in Sherlock Holmes. Only a year later, the television series Sherlock began presenting Benedict Cumberbatch's Holmes and Martin Freeman's Watson in contemporary London. Although the productions were independent and radically different in setting, together they contributed to an extraordinary period of renewed international interest in Conan Doyle's characters. Holmes suddenly felt modern again. The success of these interpretations encouraged audiences to reconsider what an adaptation of classic literature could be. Faithfulness no longer necessarily meant reproducing every familiar visual convention. A filmmaker could preserve essential characteristics while changing tone, pacing, presentation, and genre. Guy Ritchie's Holmes could participate in explosions and elaborate action sequences while still being recognizable through deduction, disguise, chemistry, experimentation, violin playing, and his complicated friendship with Watson. The film also influenced the visual identity associated with Victorian action entertainment. Its London is industrial, crowded, dirty, dangerous, and constantly under construction. Tower Bridge becomes especially important because the story takes place while the structure is still being built. This creates a city positioned between historical tradition and technological modernity. Steam machinery, laboratories, shipyards, factories, underground chambers, and engineering projects give the film an almost mechanical personality. That visual approach connected Sherlock Holmes with a growing mainstream popularity of steampunk imagery. The movie is not purely a steampunk story, but its fascination with Victorian machinery, experimental technology, industrial architecture, elaborate devices, and alternative forms of scientific spectacle made it appealing to audiences interested in that aesthetic. Posters, costumes, fan art, games, and online discussions frequently emphasized this mixture of Victorian history and mechanical fantasy. The movie also played with the historical conflict between science and superstition. Lord Blackwood builds his power by convincing people that supernatural forces protect him. Apparent resurrection, ritual murder, secret societies, mysterious symbols, and seemingly impossible death create the impression that Holmes may finally have encountered something beyond rational explanation. Yet Holmes continues searching for physical causes. This theme gave the film relevance beyond its Victorian setting. Blackwood understands that fear can become a political weapon. He does not merely want people to believe in magic. He wants their belief to make them obedient. The movie therefore presents manipulation as a form of power. Sherlock Holmes was an ambitious production because director Guy Ritchie and his collaborators wanted to create a Victorian adventure that felt historically recognizable without becoming a conventional costume drama. The filmmakers were dealing with characters known around the world, yet their intention was to uncover qualities from Arthur Conan Doyle's writing that previous screen adaptations had often minimized. Holmes would be eccentric, dangerous, physically capable, and unpredictable, while Watson would be a soldier and experienced partner rather than a passive assistant. This philosophy influenced nearly every decision made behind the scenes. Ritchie was an interesting choice to direct the project. Before Sherlock Holmes, he was primarily associated with fast, stylized British crime films such as Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, Snatch, and Rock'n'Roller. His movies were known for criminals, complicated plots, aggressive humor, unusual editing, and energetic visual storytelling. Applying that style to Sherlock Holmes allowed the production to combine the structure of a detective mystery with the momentum of a modern action film. The screenplay developed through several writers, with a finished film credited to Michael Robert Johnson, Anthony Peckham, and Simon Kinberg. The filmmakers drew inspiration from Conan Doyle's characters and world rather than adapting one particular Holmes story. Lord Blackwood was created specifically for the movie, allowing the writers to construct a mystery involving occult imagery, political conspiracy, scientific deception, and large-scale action without being restricted by the plot of an existing story. Robert Downey Jr. became deeply involved in defining this version of Holmes. His casting arrived at a remarkable moment in his career, shortly after Iron Man had restored him to the center of blockbuster filmmaking. Downey approached Holmes as someone whose extraordinary intelligence affected every aspect of his personality. The character was not meant to become brilliant only when investigating a crime. His mind was constantly operating, whether he was examining a room, irritating Watson, conducting experiments, or preparing for a fight. Physical preparation became especially important. Downey had experience with Wing Chun training, and the production incorporated his physical abilities into Holmes's fighting style. Rather than transforming Holmes into a conventional muscular action hero, the fights were designed around calculation. Holmes observes an opponent, identifies weaknesses, predicts responses, and constructs an attack mentally before carrying it out. These moments required careful coordination between acting, stunt work, editing, sound, and cinematography. The first version of an attack is presented as Holmes's mental prediction. The action then returns to real time and the plan is executed with sudden speed. The result became one of the movie's defining techniques because it translated Holmes's deductive ability into something visually exciting. Jude Law's casting as Watson was equally significant. Ritchie wanted to move away from portrayals that treated Watson as an older, confused companion. Conan Doyle had described Watson as a military doctor who had served in Afghanistan, giving the filmmakers a strong basis for making him physically capable. Law's Watson could therefore participate naturally in fights, shoot accurately, recognize injuries, and challenge Holmes. Downey and Law's chemistry developed into one of the production's greatest strengths. Their scenes depended on extremely precise comic timing. Holmes and Watson frequently interrupt, insult, and provoke one another, but the humor works because the affection beneath their arguments remains visible. Ritchie encouraged the feeling that these characters had shared many adventures before the audience met them. Rachel McAdams joined the cast as Irene Adler. The production expanded her importance beyond her limited appearance in Conan Doyle's original stories. Irene was designed as a character who could disrupt Holmes's confidence because he could not approach her with complete emotional detachment. Her costumes, entrances, and dialogue were constructed to make her appear comfortable moving through different social environments while concealing her true intentions. Mark Strong's Lord Blackwood provided the opposite kind of challenge. Strong and Ritchie had already worked together on Rock and Roller, and the actors' controlled intensity suited a villain who needed to project supernatural authority. Blackwood's threat depends heavily on presentation. Rituals, symbols, carefully staged deaths, and his apparent return from the grave encourage other characters to believe that he possesses powers beyond scientific explanation. Creating Victorian London was one of the production's largest challenges. Much of modern London no longer resembles the city of the 1890s, so the filmmakers combined practical locations, constructed sets, visual effects, and digital extensions. Filming took place at numerous locations around England, including areas of London, Liverpool, Manchester, and historic properties capable of representing the required period architecture. Liverpool was particularly valuable because its 19th-century buildings could stand in for sections of Victorian London. The production could then alter skylines, remove modern elements, and add digital structures. This combination helped the city feel larger and more historically convincing than would have been possible using entirely constructed environments. One of the film's most memorable historical elements is Tower Bridge under construction. The real bridge opened in 1894, and showing it unfinished immediately establishes a specific period while also providing a spectacular location for the climax. Since the completed modern bridge obviously could not simply be returned to its construction stage, extensive visual effects were required to recreate its unfinished structure. Sherlock Holmes begins by placing the audience directly inside an investigation rather than slowly introducing its characters. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson race through Victorian London to prevent Lord Henry Blackwood from completing a ritual murder. Holmes arrives first and silently analyzes the guards standing in his way. He mentally calculates a sequence of attacks, predicts their consequences, and then performs them with remarkable precision. This opening immediately establishes the film's narrative language, observation leads to deduction, deduction leads to action, and the audience is sometimes allowed to enter Holmes's mind before events occur. Holmes and Watson interrupt Blackwood's ceremony and rescue a young woman. Inspector Lestrade and the police arrive shortly afterward, arresting Blackwood. The sequence initially appears to conclude an adventure rather than begin one. Blackwood has already murdered several women, and his capture gives Holmes and Watson what seems like a successful ending. This structure is deliberate because the real mystery begins only after the apparent villain has been defeated. 3 months later, Blackwood is sentenced to death. Watson is preparing to leave Baker Street and marry Mary Morstan, creating the film's central personal conflict. Holmes is intellectually restless and emotionally threatened by the possibility of losing his closest companion. His destructive experiments and antisocial behavior reveal that solving crimes gives structure to his life. Without a mystery and without Watson, he has difficulty functioning normally. Before his execution, Blackwood asks to see Holmes. During their meeting, he predicts that 3 more people will die and claims that his death will only begin a much greater transformation. Blackwood is then hanged and officially declared dead by Watson. The story now appears finished again, but this certainty is quickly destroyed when Blackwood's tomb is discovered broken open and witnesses claim to have seen him walking away alive. The apparent resurrection changes the genre of the story. What began as a detective adventure now appears to contain supernatural horror. Holmes, however, refuses to accept a supernatural explanation. This creates the movie's primary narrative question. Has Blackwood genuinely returned from death? Or has someone constructed an elaborate illusion? The audience is encouraged to doubt both possibilities because Blackwood's predictions repeatedly appear to come true. At the same time, Irene Adler returns to Holmes's life. She asks him to locate a missing man named Luke Riordan. Holmes immediately understands that Irene is working for someone else, but his feelings toward her make the situation unusually complicated. Riordan is soon revealed to be the man found inside Blackwood's coffin. This connects Irene's seemingly separate assignment directly to the resurrection mystery. Holmes and Watson investigate Riordan's home and discover a laboratory filled with chemicals, scientific equipment, and evidence of unusual experiments. The investigation begins shifting the story away from genuine magic and toward manipulated science. Yet the screenplay deliberately avoids explaining everything immediately. Each answer produces another question, keeping Holmes and the audience moving through a chain of clues. The trail eventually leads Holmes and Watson into an industrial action sequence involving Blackwood's associates. The investigation becomes increasingly dangerous, and an enormous explosion nearly kills Watson. This moment is important structurally because it changes the emotional stakes. Until this point, Holmes often treats danger as entertainment. Seeing Watson injured forces him to confront the consequences of his obsession. Blackwood's larger plan gradually becomes visible through his connection to a secret organization known as the Temple of the Four Orders. The society includes powerful figures within the British establishment. Blackwood reveals that he is connected by blood to its leadership and intends to seize control through fear. His apparent supernatural abilities are essential because they convince influential men that resistance is useless. Several deaths reinforce this illusion. Each appears impossible or mystical when first presented. One victim seems to die through supernatural combustion, while another is killed in a bath under circumstances designed to suggest magical intervention. The narrative repeatedly follows the same pattern. Blackwood creates an extraordinary spectacle. Witnesses interpret it as supernatural power, and Holmes searches for the concealed physical mechanism. Holmes eventually becomes a target himself. After entering the temple and challenging Blackwood, he is framed for crimes and forced into hiding. This reverses his normal position. The detective who usually works alongside Scotland Yard is now being hunted by the authorities. The shift increases the pace of the final act and isolates Holmes from conventional institutions. The mystery begins to resolve when Holmes recognizes that Blackwood's rituals and symbols form a pattern connected to locations around London. The supposedly magical events have been carefully engineered. Blackwood has used science, chemistry, hidden mechanisms, and psychological manipulation to manufacture the appearance of supernatural power. His final objective is political. Blackwood intends to eliminate members of Parliament using a chemical weapon distributed through the ventilation system beneath the Palace of Westminster. His followers have secretly received an antidote, meaning they will survive while their opponents die. The resulting massacre would appear to prove that Blackwood possesses supernatural protection and divine authority. Sherlock Holmes is presented as an action mystery, but beneath its fights, explosions, conspiracies, and rapid deductions lies a story built around several interconnected themes. The most important are reason against superstition, fear as an instrument of power, friendship and emotional dependence, the conflict between progress and tradition, and the difference between appearance and reality. Guy Ritchie develops these ideas through the mystery itself, but also through locations, objects, relationships, and recurring visual contrasts. The clearest theme is the conflict between reason and superstition. Lord Blackwood deliberately presents himself as a supernatural figure. His rituals contain occult symbols, his victims appear to die through impossible methods, and his apparent resurrection suggests that he has conquered death. Blackwood understands that an enemy who seems human can be resisted, but an enemy believed to possess supernatural powers can inspire much greater fear. Holmes represents the opposite philosophy. He refuses to accept the impossible simply because he does not immediately understand it. Every mysterious event must have a mechanism. Every miracle contains evidence. Every supernatural claim can potentially be examined through chemistry, medicine, engineering, or observation. The conflict between Holmes and Blackwood is therefore intellectual as well as physical. Importantly, the film does not portray Holmes as someone who already knows every answer. He experiences uncertainty. Blackwood deliberately constructs events that challenge Holmes's confidence, and for portions of the investigation, the detective cannot explain what he has witnessed. His rationalism is powerful because it is a method rather than a collection of predetermined answers. Holmes continues examining evidence even when that evidence initially appears to contradict his beliefs. This leads to another major theme, the manipulation of fear. Blackwood's greatest weapon is not poison, physical strength, or political influence. It is his ability to control what people believe. His supposed resurrection is valuable because people behave differently once they think he cannot be killed. Members of the secret order begin obeying him because resistance appears both dangerous and useless. The symbolism surrounding Blackwood constantly reinforces this manufactured image. Fire, darkness, ritual circles, graves, robes, secret chambers, and religious language create an atmosphere of ancient power. Yet behind these symbols are laboratories, chemicals, mechanical devices, and carefully planned deceptions. The contrast reveals the central trick of Blackwood's strategy. Modern science is hidden behind the appearance of ancient magic. The film repeatedly asks whether power comes from what is true or from what people can be persuaded to believe. Blackwood does not require genuine supernatural abilities if everyone behaves as though he possesses them. His illusion becomes politically useful because fear produces obedience. Holmes defeats him by exposing the machinery beneath the performance. Appearance and reality therefore become recurring themes. Irene Adler survives by presenting different versions of herself. Holmes uses disguises and deliberately allows people to underestimate him. Blackwood hides science inside a cult spectacle. Moriarty remains physically concealed while influencing events from a distance. Nearly every important character understands that controlling appearances can provide an advantage. Holmes himself is also defined by contradictions between appearance and reality. He can look disorganized, childish, or even ridiculous, yet his apparent chaos often conceals intense observation. His rooms are filled with disorder, but his mind can construct astonishing patterns from tiny details. He frequently behaves as though he does not care about other people's emotions, while his reaction to Watson's departure reveals deep attachment. This creates the film's strongest emotional theme, friendship and dependence. Holmes and Watson clearly care for one another, but Holmes has difficulty expressing affection directly. Instead, his fear of losing Watson appears as irritation, manipulation, jealousy, and attempts to interfere with Watson's relationship with Mary. Watson represents stability. He wants marriage, domestic life, and a future beyond endless investigations. Holmes represents uncertainty and adventure. Their conflict is not caused by a lack of friendship, but by the fact that friendship cannot remain unchanged forever. Watson is moving into another stage of his life, while Holmes desperately wants their familiar existence at Baker Street to continue. Baker Street consequently becomes more than a location. It symbolizes the shared life Holmes fears losing. The rooms contain memories of investigations, experiments, arguments, and routines. Watson's departure threatens the emotional structure hidden beneath Holmes's apparent independence. Mary Morstand symbolizes change in a different way. Holmes initially treats her as a rival for Watson's attention, but she is not presented as an enemy. She is intelligent enough to understand Holmes and confident enough to resist his attempts to dominate conversation. Her presence forces Holmes to confront a reality he cannot solve through deduction. Watson has desires and responsibilities that exist independently of him. Irene Adler introduces another form of emotional vulnerability. Holmes can analyze strangers almost instantly, but Irene complicates his judgment because he has personal feelings for her. She represents uncertainty in a man obsessed with certainty. Holmes wants to understand motives, yet Irene repeatedly operates beyond his complete control. Her relationship with Holmes also reflects the theme of equality. Holmes is accustomed to entering rooms as the most intelligent person present. Irene's importance comes partly from her ability to surprise him. She understands his curiosity and knows that withholding information can manipulate him more effectively than direct force. Sherlock Holmes has a distinctive visual identity that immediately separates it from the polished appearance of many traditional Victorian dramas. Director Guy Ritchie and cinematographer Philippe Rousselot create a London that feels dirty, industrial, crowded, dangerous, and constantly in motion. The movie does not present the 19th century as an elegant historical painting. Instead, its streets are filled with smoke, mud, machinery, construction, fire, narrow alleys, workshops, and enormous industrial structures. The visual style supports the central idea that Holmes lives in a society moving rapidly between an older world and a new technological age. The color palette is deliberately restrained. Browns, grays, dirty greens, blacks, and faded metallic tones dominate many scenes. Bright colors are relatively uncommon, giving London an aged and weathered appearance. The image often resembles old photographs that have been given movement and depth. This subdued palette also allows important visual elements, especially fire, blood, chemicals, and certain costumes, to attract immediate attention. Lighting plays an equally important role. Interiors frequently depend on windows, fireplaces, candles, and lamps, creating strong contrast between light and shadow. Blackwood's scenes make particularly effective use of darkness. His rituals occur in spaces where limited illumination hides details from both the characters and the audience. This visual uncertainty supports his supposed supernatural powers. If viewers cannot clearly see how something happens, the impossible initially seems more believable. Holmes's environments are different but equally complicated. Baker Street is filled with objects, papers, books, scientific instruments, weapons, chemicals, furniture, and unfinished experiments. The camera frequently has several layers of information available within a single composition. This visual density reflects Holmes's mind. Where another person might see disorder, Holmes sees connections. The cinematography often places the audience inside Holmes's perception rather than simply observing him from outside. The clearest example is his method of planning fights. Time appears to slow dramatically while Holmes examines his opponent. The camera isolates specific physical details as his internal voice identifies weaknesses and predicts reactions. He mentally constructs the attack before executing it. When the action returns to real time, the same movements happen much faster. This contrast between slow analysis and rapid execution provides a visual representation of Holmes's intelligence. The audience experiences how much information he processes within only a few seconds. Deduction becomes cinematic rather than merely verbal. Ritchie uses changes in speed throughout the film. Slow motion emphasizes impacts, explosions, debris, and moments of physical danger. Sudden acceleration then restores the chaotic energy of the action. These changes prevent fights from becoming visually repetitive and suggest that Holmes experiences time differently depending on how intensely he is analyzing a situation. The action photography is frequently rough and physical. Characters collide with walls, furniture, machinery, and the environment around them. Holmes does not fight like an elegant superhero. His confrontations feel improvised and occasionally painful. Watson also participates directly, reinforcing the idea that both men have considerable experience with violence. Industrial locations are central to the movie's visual language. Shipyards, factories, laboratories, underground chambers, docks, bridges, and mechanical spaces appear repeatedly. These environments give the story enormous visual scale while supporting its themes. Blackwood wants people to believe that ancient supernatural forces have returned, yet the world surrounding him is filled with evidence of technological transformation. Tower Bridge provides the strongest example. The movie presents the bridge while it is still under construction. Its incomplete steel framework creates a dramatic geometric background for the final confrontation between Holmes and Blackwood. The exposed structure allows the camera to emphasize height, machinery, ropes, chains, and open space. The unfinished bridge is also visually symbolic. London itself appears unfinished, moving toward modernity but still connected to older traditions and beliefs. Blackwood exploits those beliefs while secretly using science and engineering. Holmes represents a more openly rational response to the same changing world. Visual effects were essential to creating this version of London. Modern cities contain architecture, traffic systems, and technology that obviously did not exist during the Victorian period. The filmmakers therefore combined practical locations and sets with digital extensions. Buildings could be expanded, modern elements removed, and skylines reconstructed. The soundtrack of Sherlock Holmes is one of the most distinctive elements of the film. Composer Hans Zimmer faced the challenge of creating music for one of literature's most recognizable characters without relying on the elegant orchestral sound normally associated with Victorian mysteries. Director Guy Ritchie's version of Holmes was eccentric, physical, unpredictable, and surrounded by a dainty industrial London. Zimmer responded with a score that sounds similarly unstable. Instead of presenting Holmes as a refined intellectual, the music suggests that his mind is a strange machine that is constantly thinking, experimenting, and moving. The main musical identity is built around an unusual combination of strings, percussion, piano, folk influences, and deliberately rough textures. Instruments frequently sound imperfect rather than beautifully polished. This is essential to the personality of the score. Holmes may be brilliant, but his life is chaotic. His apartment is disorganized, his experiments are dangerous, and his behavior can change suddenly from complete concentration to childish excitement. The music reflects these contradictions. One of the most recognizable elements is the use of an intentionally damaged and out-of-tune piano sound. Instead of the clean piano that might accompany a sophisticated period drama, the instrument has an unstable quality. Notes can feel slightly broken or uncomfortable. The effect gives the music character immediately. It sounds as though the score itself has been pulled from Holmes's cluttered rooms and modified during one of his experiments. Strings are equally important, particularly the violin. Holmes is traditionally associated with the violin through Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, making string instruments an obvious connection to the character. Zimmer does not simply use them as a historical reference. The strings can become nervous, aggressive, playful, or obsessive. Repeated patterns suggest the constant movement of Holmes's thoughts. This creates a musical representation of deduction. When Holmes becomes interested in a problem, his attention narrows and his mind begins connecting details. The score often responds with repeating rhythms that gradually build complexity. Musical fragments appear to chase one another, creating the feeling that several ideas are developing simultaneously. Percussion gives the film much of its physical energy. Ritchie's action scenes are not graceful sword fights in elegant rooms. They involve punches, industrial machinery, explosions, collapsing structures, and characters being thrown through dangerous environments. The percussion therefore feels heavy and mechanical, connecting the music with the industrial world visible on screen. The score also contains folk-like qualities that prevent it from sounding like a conventional Hollywood action soundtrack. Certain melodies have an almost wandering or improvised character. This suits Holmes because he frequently appears to be improvising even when his actions are based on careful reasoning. The music can seem playful at precisely the moment when the situation is becoming dangerous. Zimmer also avoids making Lord Blackwood's supernatural imagery completely serious. Blackwood wants the world to believe that ancient forces support him, and some musical passages initially encourage this threatening atmosphere. Dark textures, low sounds, ritualistic rhythms, and sustained tension create the possibility that something genuinely unnatural is occurring. However, the score exists inside a story that eventually reveals scientific explanations for these supposed miracles. The music therefore balances darkness with eccentricity. The supernatural threat is frightening, but the film never entirely leaves Holmes's rational and occasionally humorous perspective. The contrast between Holmes and Blackwood is partly expressed through sound. Holmes's musical world is restless and irregular. Blackwood's scenes often feel heavier and more ceremonial. Holmes represents movement and investigation, while Blackwood attempts to create an image of certainty and destiny. Their different sonic environments support their opposing philosophies. Sound design is equally important during Holmes's fight sequences. Before attacking, Holmes sometimes calculates the encounter internally. At these moments, the normal rhythm of the environment changes. His voice becomes dominant while physical sounds are isolated and emphasized. The audience hears his predicted consequences before witnessing the real attack. When the plan is executed, the sound becomes faster and more immediate. Punches, impacts, breaking objects, and bodily movement arrive with greater force. The contrast between calculated silence and sudden violence creates the impression that Holmes experiences combat differently from everyone around him. The industrial environments provide another rich source of sound. Machinery, metal, chains, construction, steam, weapons, and explosions fill the soundtrack. London does not merely look industrial, it sounds industrial. This is particularly important because the city is almost a character within the film. Baker Street has its own sonic personality. Holmes's experiments, movements, violin playing, conversations, and domestic chaos create an intimate contrast with the enormous soundscape outside. These quieter scenes allow dialogue and small noises to become important. The audience can hear Holmes manipulating objects or moving through his environment, reinforcing his constant physical restlessness. The conversations between Holmes and Watson also depend heavily on rhythm. Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law frequently speak quickly, interrupt one another, and shift from serious discussion to irritation or comedy. The soundtrack must leave enough space for these exchanges because their verbal timing is one of the movie's primary sources of humor. Silence and reduced sound are used strategically. When Holmes concentrates on a clue, the surrounding environment can become less important. The film effectively reduces the world around him so that a particular observation receives greater attention. This creates an auditory equivalent of a visual close-up. Sherlock Holmes arrived in theaters in December 2009 with considerable expectations. The character was already one of the most famous figures in detective fiction. Robert Downey Jr. had recently become a major blockbuster star through Iron Man, and Guy Ritchie was attempting a much more action-oriented interpretation than many audiences associated with Sherlock Holmes. The result produced a generally positive but sometimes divided critical response. Audiences largely embraced the film, while critics frequently praise its performances, energy, production design, and entertainment value even when questioning its emphasis on action over traditional detective storytelling. Commercially, the movie was a major success. Released during the competitive Christmas period, it opened against extremely strong films and still established itself as a significant international attraction. It eventually earned more than $500 million worldwide, an impressive result for a period mystery built around literary characters rather than superheroes or contemporary action franchise. Its performance demonstrated that Sherlock Holmes could function successfully as the center of a modern blockbuster series. Much of the positive response focused on Robert Downey Jr. His Holmes was deliberately unconventional. Instead of portraying the detective as permanently elegant and emotionally controlled, Downey presented him as messy, restless, sarcastic, physically aggressive, and socially difficult. Some viewers initially questioned whether this interpretation moved too far away from the familiar screen image of Holmes. Others argued that many of these qualities could be connected to elements already present in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories. Downey's charisma proved crucial. Critics who had reservations about the film's complicated mystery or large action sequences often still praised his ability to hold the production together. His rapid delivery, comic timing, physical performance, and eccentric behavior gave the movie a clear personality. The role earned Downey the Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Motion Picture Musical or Comedy, providing major recognition for his interpretation. Jude Law also received considerable praise as Dr. Watson. His performance challenged the popular stereotype of Watson as a slow or confused assistant. Law's Watson was intelligent, physically capable, impatient, courageous, and willing to challenge Holmes directly. Many critics considered the chemistry between Downey and Law the strongest element of the film. Their relationship gave the story an emotional foundation that extended beyond the central mystery. Holmes does not want Watson to leave Baker Street, while Watson wants to marry Mary and establish a more stable life. Their arguments often resemble those of two people who know each other so well that they can identify every weakness immediately. Audiences responded strongly to this mixture of irritation, loyalty, competition, and affection. Rachel McAdams received a somewhat more mixed response as Irene Adler. Her charisma and chemistry with Downey were frequently appreciated, and the film gave Irene an active role in the larger conspiracy. However, some criticism focused on how much narrative space the screenplay gave her compared with Holmes and Watson. The character also served partly as a connection to the unseen Professor Moriarty, meaning that some of his storyline existed to prepare future developments. Mark Strong's Lord Blackwood was generally recognized as an effective antagonist. His controlled performance helped maintain the supernatural atmosphere surrounding the mystery. Blackwood needed to appear capable of convincing intelligent and powerful people that he had returned from death, and Strong's calm confidence made that threat credible within the heightened world of the movie. The visual presentation attracted significant attention. Critics noted the dainty, industrial quality of Victorian London, which avoided the polished appearance associated with some period dramas. Streets were crowded, buildings were weathered, factories produced smoke, and enormous engineering projects suggested a society being transformed by technology. The production design and art direction were recognized during awards season. The film received Academy Award nominations for Best Art Direction and Best Original Score. Although it did not win either category, the nominations reflected two of the production's most widely admired technical elements. Hans Zimmer's score was particularly distinctive. Rather than relying entirely on elegant orchestral music, Zimmer created eccentric themes using unusual instrumental textures and intentionally rough sounds. The score matched Downey's unstable and energetic interpretation of Holmes and became one of the film's most recognizable features. Guy Ritchie's direction produced stronger disagreement. Supporters enjoyed the rapid editing, unusual camera speeds, aggressive action, humor, and visualization of Holmes's thought process. The scenes in which Holmes mentally plans a fight before executing it were frequently singled out as an inventive way of transforming deduction into visual action. Other critics felt that the stylistic techniques occasionally overwhelmed the mystery. For viewers expecting a restrained detective story, explosions, fistfights, industrial destruction, and large-scale spectacle could seem excessive. The movie was sometimes described as turning Sherlock Holmes into an action hero rather than allowing investigation to dominate the narrative. The plot itself was another source of mixed reactions. Blackwood's apparent supernatural resurrection, the secret society, ritual murders, scientific experiments, political conspiracy, and Irene's mysterious employer created a dense collection of story elements. Some audiences enjoyed the complexity because it gave Holmes numerous clues to connect. Others found the mystery unnecessarily complicated or believed that the final explanation arrived through too much exposition. Sherlock Holmes developed a lasting legacy by proving that one of literature's oldest and most frequently adapted heroes could still operate successfully within modern blockbuster cinema. The film did not reinvent the detective by abandoning Arthur Conan Doyle's foundations. Instead, it emphasized characteristics that could support a faster and more physical form of storytelling. Holmes remained an observer, scientist, master of disguise, violinist, and brilliant detective, but he was also presented as a fighter, eccentric outsider, and emotionally difficult friend. This combination helped create a version of the character that belonged unmistakably to the late 2000s. The most immediate evidence of the film's legacy was its commercial success. Earning more than $500 million worldwide demonstrated that Sherlock Holmes could compete internationally with major action and franchise entertainment. This was significant because the film was based on characters created in the 19th century and remained largely within a Victorian setting. Hollywood did not need to move Holmes into the present day to make him commercially relevant. A sequel quickly became possible. Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows arrived in 2011 with Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law returning as Holmes and Watson. Professor Moriarty, deliberately kept in the shadows during much of the first movie, became the central antagonist. The sequel expanded the scale of the story beyond London and transformed the intellectual conflict between Holmes and Moriarty into the heart of the narrative. The existence of the sequel reinforced one of the first film's most important achievements. Downey and Law had become a recognizable Holmes and Watson partnership. Their chemistry was not simply an element of the story but part of the franchise's identity. Audiences returned partly to watch another mystery, but also to see these two characters argue, compete, cooperate, and repeatedly risk their lives for one another. The 2009 film also contributed to a broader revival of Sherlock Holmes in 21st century popular culture. The television series Sherlock followed in 2010, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman. It was not a continuation of Ritchie's film and approached the material very differently, moving Holmes into contemporary London. Nevertheless, the close timing of these successful interpretations helped create a period in which Sherlock Holmes again became especially visible to younger international audiences. The two versions demonstrated the extraordinary adaptability of Conan Doyle's creation. Downey's Holmes could exist inside a Victorian action-adventure, while Cumberbatch's Holmes could use smartphones and modern forensic technology. Both remained recognizable because the essential appeal was not dependent on one particular historical image. Observation, deduction, arrogance, curiosity, unusual behavior, and a relationship with Watson could survive dramatic changes in presentation. Ritchie's film was particularly influential in how it visualized intelligence. The calculated fight sequences allowed the audience to experience Holmes's reasoning before watching his plan unfold physically. Slow motion, internal narration, close observation, and rapid execution turned thought into spectacle. This was more than an action gimmick. It demonstrated a useful cinematic solution to a problem faced by detective stories. How can a filmmaker make thinking visually exciting? The movie's interpretation of Watson also contributed to changing popular expectations. Jude Law's Watson is not simply present so Holmes can explain clues to him. He is a doctor, veteran, marksman, fighter, an independent personality. He can save Holmes, disagree with him, and make decisions without his approval. Their partnership feels more balanced than the stereotype associated with some older adaptations. This stronger Watson became important to the emotional legacy of the movie. Many viewers remember the relationship between Holmes and Watson as clearly as they remember Blackwood's conspiracy. Their friendship is tension because Watson wants to move forward with his life while Holmes fears losing the person who understands him best. The detective story is therefore supported by something more personal, the possibility that an important friendship is changing. The visual representation of Victorian London also became one of the film's defining legacies. Rather than presenting the city as clean and picturesque, the production emphasized industrial transformation. Smoke, mud, factories, shipyards, laboratories, machinery, construction sites, and unfinished architecture dominate the environment. This imagery helped strengthen the connection between Victorian adventure and the mechanical aesthetics often associated with steampunk. Sherlock Holmes is not entirely a steampunk film, but its fascination with machinery, experimental science, engineering, and industrial spectacle placed it close enough to that visual culture to appeal strongly to similar audiences. Hans Zimmer's soundtrack also left a distinctive mark. His score rejected the expectation that Holmes required purely elegant and sophisticated music. The deliberately rough piano textures, unusual strings, folk-like melodies, and unstable rhythms created a musical identity connected directly to Downey's eccentric performance. The film also participated in a larger Hollywood trend of reconstructing familiar properties as franchise entertainment. During this era, established characters were increasingly given darker textures, more elaborate origin stories, larger action sequences, and interconnected sequel possibilities. Sherlock Holmes demonstrated that this approach could be applied not only to superheroes or spies, but also to classic literature. However, its influence should not be reduced to action. The movie succeeds because it recognizes that Holmes's intelligence must remain the source of his power. Even when he fights through analysis. When Blackwood appears supernatural, Holmes searches for mechanisms. When Moriarty manipulates events from the shadows, the threat is frightening because Holmes recognizes another mind capable of complex planning. For many viewers, Sherlock Holmes was memorable not simply because it offered another mystery involving the famous detective, but because it made familiar characters feel unexpectedly contemporary. Audiences who already knew Sherlock Holmes from books, television, or older films could recognize the foundations of the character, while younger viewers could approach him as a new kind of action hero. The film created a bridge between generations by combining Victorian detective fiction with the speed, humor, spectacle, and character dynamics associated with modern blockbuster cinema. One of the strongest audience reactions centered on Robert Downey Jr. His Holmes was very different from the controlled and formally dressed detective many people expected. He was brilliant but disorganized, confident but emotionally awkward, physically capable but personally self-destructive. For some longtime fans, this interpretation initially seemed unusual. For others, it was refreshing because it revealed qualities that had sometimes been minimized by earlier adaptations. Younger audiences in particular encountered a Holmes who did not feel like a distant literary figure assigned in school. He participated in fights, experiments, disguises, dangerous investigations, and elaborate escapes. Yet his greatest ability remained his intelligence. The film made observation itself entertaining, especially when viewers were allowed to experience his mental calculations before a fight or during an investigation. This created one of the movie's most satisfying pleasures. Audiences were encouraged to look at the same evidence as Holmes while knowing that he was probably several steps ahead. A small object, chemical trace, unusual injury, or apparently meaningless detail could later become essential. Viewers were therefore not simply watching an adventure. They were being invited to participate in the detective process. The relationship between Holmes and Watson became another major source of audience attachment. Many viewers interpreted their friendship as the true emotional center of the story. Blackwood provides the external danger, but Watson's decision to marry Mary creates the conflict that affects Holmes personally. Holmes can examine a crime scene without becoming emotionally overwhelmed, yet he cannot comfortably accept that Watson is leaving Baker Street. His jealousy appears through jokes, arguments, interference, and passive aggression. Audiences could recognize something very human beneath this exaggerated behavior, the fear that an important relationship is changing. Watson also became especially popular because Jude Law's performance gave him independence. He is not merely the person who asks questions while Holmes provides answers. He is a doctor, soldier, fighter, and capable investigator. He becomes frustrated with Holmes precisely because he understands him so well. Their arguments produce some of the film's most popular humor. Audiences frequently describe their dynamic as resembling an old married couple. The comparison became common because Holmes and Watson know each other's habits, weaknesses, financial problems, emotional vulnerabilities, and methods of provoking one another. Yet when genuine danger appears, their loyalty is immediate. For some viewers, the film was therefore less about solving Blackwood's conspiracy than about watching this partnership survive change. Watson wants a future with Mary, while Holmes wants the familiar past to continue. Neither character is entirely wrong. This gives their conflict emotional weight without requiring a conventional dramatic separation. Irene Adler produced another form of audience interest. She is one of the few characters who can make Holmes uncertain. Viewers accustomed to watching him immediately understand everyone around him could enjoy seeing someone interfere with his confidence. His attraction to Irene creates a weakness that cannot be solved through ordinary deduction. Different audiences interpreted their relationship in different ways. Some saw Irene as Holmes's natural romantic counterpart because she could challenge him intellectually. Others considered the Holmes and Watson relationship far more important to the movie's emotional structure. The film leaves enough ambiguity for both readings to exist. Blackwood's supernatural presentation also affected audience interpretation. During the first viewing, viewers are deliberately encouraged to question whether the film might actually introduce magic. Blackwood survives his execution, appears to predict deaths, and seems protected by forces Holmes cannot immediately explain. For audiences familiar with Holmes, this creates tension because rational explanation is central to the character's identity. The pleasure comes from waiting for Holmes to expose the trick. When the supposedly supernatural events are finally explained through chemicals, mechanisms, medicine, and deception, the resolution confirms the worldview audiences expected from him. This also gave the story a broader meaning. Blackwood's power exists because people believe his performance. He understands that fear can be stronger than physical force. Some viewers interpreted this as commentary on political manipulation, propaganda, and the ability of powerful individuals to control groups by constructing threats. The interpretation became especially relevant because Holmes defeats Blackwood through investigation rather than belief. He refuses to accept the explanation presented to him simply because it is frightening or widely accepted. For audiences, this could be understood as a defense of skepticism and critical thinking. Sherlock Holmes builds much of its emotional strength around characters who are facing change. The mystery involving Lord Blackwood provides the external conflict, but the personal story is driven by Sherlock Holmes, Dr. John Watson, Irene Adler, and their complicated relationships. None of these characters undergoes a complete transformation. Instead, the film reveals vulnerabilities beneath their established personalities and forces them to recognize relationships they would often prefer to control, avoid, or hide. Sherlock begins as a man who appears almost entirely defined by his need for intellectual stimulation. When he has a case, his extraordinary mind has direction. Without one, he becomes restless and destructive. He experiments inside Baker Street, isolates himself, behaves unpredictably, and searches for anything capable of preventing boredom. Crime is therefore more than a profession for Holmes. It provides structure to his existence. His greatest conflict at the beginning is not Blackwood. It is Watson's decision to leave Baker Street and marry Mary Morstan. Holmes understands complicated criminal behavior almost instantly, yet he struggles to process a perfectly ordinary development in his friend's life. Watson's engagement represents change, and Holmes responds by attempting to resist that change rather than openly admitting that he is afraid of losing his companion. This reveals one of Holmes's central contradictions. He can identify tiny physical details and reconstruct another person's history, but he has difficulty expressing his own emotions. His intelligence becomes almost useless when the problem cannot be solved logically. He cannot deduce Watson into remaining at Baker Street. Holmes consequently hides affection behind irritation. He criticizes Watson's choices, interferes with his relationship, and behaves badly during his first meeting with Mary. His famous observational abilities, normally used to solve crimes, become socially destructive when he analyzes Mary without sufficient restraint. The scene demonstrates that Holmes's greatest talent can also become a personal weakness. The Blackwood investigation gives Holmes a temporary escape from this emotional problem. Once Blackwood appears to return from the dead, Holmes again has something difficult enough to occupy his entire mind. Yet Watson's involvement means that Holmes cannot completely separate the case from his personal life. This becomes especially clear after Watson is injured during the industrial explosion. Holmes is accustomed to treating danger almost like an intellectual game. Watson's injury reminds him that his adventures have consequences for people he cares about. Downey's performance becomes more restrained during these moments, allowing Holmes's concern to appear without requiring him to deliver an emotional confession. By the end, Holmes has not suddenly become emotionally open or socially comfortable. That would contradict the character established throughout the film. His development is smaller and more believable. He begins to recognize that Watson can build a life with Mary without completely abandoning their friendship. Watson has a complementary arc. At the beginning, he is trying to separate himself from the chaotic life he shares with Holmes. He wants to marry Mary, establish his own home, and create stability. Yet he repeatedly returns to the investigation because part of him genuinely enjoys the danger and intellectual excitement. This contradiction makes Watson more complicated than the sensible companion standing beside an eccentric genius. He complains about Holmes's behavior, gambling, experiments, and recklessness, but he continues participating. Holmes does not force Watson into every dangerous situation. Watson chooses to return. His military history helps explain this attraction. Watson is a doctor and former soldier who has experienced danger before meeting Holmes. Baker Street provides chaos, but it also provides purpose and excitement. Marriage offers another form of purpose. His arc, therefore, involves finding a way to accept both sides of himself. Watson's relationship with Mary demonstrates his desire for adulthood and stability. He takes their engagement seriously and refuses to allow Holmes to treat Mary as temporary. When Holmes behaves disrespectfully, Watson confronts him. This is important because it establishes that loyalty to Holmes does not mean surrendering his independence. At the same time, Watson never stops caring about his friend. He understands Holmes better than almost anyone else. He recognizes his manipulations, anticipates his behavior, and knows when Holmes is concealing concern behind sarcasm. Their friendship survives because Watson can challenge Holmes rather than simply admire him. Mary also contributes to this development. She could easily have been written as an obstacle whose purpose was to separate the central partnership. Instead, she demonstrates intelligence and patience. She is understandably offended when Holmes analyzes her personal history, but she is not intimidated by him. Her presence forces both men to accept change. Watson must prove that he is serious about building a future, while Holmes must understand that friendship cannot depend on keeping Watson permanently available. Mary therefore represents emotional maturity within a story dominated by men who often communicate through insults and physical danger. Irene Adler reveals another side of Holmes. Around most people, Holmes possesses an enormous psychological advantage because he can observe them without becoming personally involved. Irene weakens that advantage. Their history means he cannot analyze her with complete emotional distance. Irene's motivations are deliberately complicated. She works for the mysterious figure eventually identified as Professor Moriarty, but she is not portrayed as completely loyal to him. She manipulates Holmes, withholds information, and pursues her own objectives, yet there are signs that her feelings for Holmes are genuine. Her arc revolves around the limits of independence. Sherlock Holmes uses costume and set design to create a Victorian world that feels historical without becoming overly polished or theatrical. Director Guy Ritchie wanted London to appear lived in, crowded, dirty, and rapidly changing. Production designer Sarah Greenwood and costume designer Jenny Bevan helped establish this identity by treating clothing, rooms, streets, laboratories, and industrial structures as extensions of the characters. The result is a world where almost every visual detail contributes to personality, social status, atmosphere, or the conflict between tradition and technological progress. Sherlock Holmes immediately challenges the most familiar visual stereotype of the detective. Instead of constantly wearing the famous deerstalker hat and immaculate formal clothing associated with many earlier screen versions, Robert Downey Jr. as Holmes often appears slightly disordered. His clothes belong to the period, but they rarely look as though they have been arranged simply to make him appear elegant. This is essential to the character. Holmes cares far more about solving a problem than maintaining his appearance. Layers of shirts, waistcoats, coats, scarves, and other garments create a practical but eccentric silhouette. Clothing can appear worn or imperfect, suggesting someone who sleeps irregularly, conducts dangerous experiments, fights criminals, and may forget ordinary routines while concentrating on a case. His costumes also support physical movement. This Holmes runs, climbs, boxes, disguises himself, and becomes involved in brutal fights. The wardrobe therefore needed to preserve a convincing Victorian appearance without restricting the action. Holmes looks like someone who belongs to the 19th century, but can still function inside Guy Ritchie's aggressive action sequences. Watson provides a strong visual contrast. Jude Law's costumes are generally more controlled and orderly. His military background, medical profession, and desire for a stable future are reflected in the way he presents himself. Watson appears more conscious of social expectations than Holmes. This difference becomes a form of characterization before either man speaks. Holmes often looks as though his clothing was selected while his attention was somewhere else. Watson looks like someone who understands how a respectable gentleman is expected to appear. Their wardrobes reinforce the fundamental contrast between chaos and discipline within their friendship. Watson's famous walking stick also has both practical and character significance. It reminds viewers that he carries physical consequences from his military service while simultaneously functioning as part of his distinguished appearance. His injuries do not make him helpless. He remains capable of fighting and surviving dangerous situations. Irene Adler receives some of the film's most sophisticated costumes. Her clothing must communicate beauty and social confidence while also supporting the fact that she is constantly performing different identities. Irene understands how appearance affects other people, making fashion one of the tools through which she controls a situation. Her costumes tend to be more visually refined than Holmes's clothing. She enters spaces with deliberate confidence and often appears completely composed even when she is concealing information. This creates another contrast with Holmes. Both characters are masters of deception, but Holmes often hides inside disorder while Irene uses elegance and control. Lord Blackwood's clothing establishes authority and menace. Dark colors and severe shapes complement Mark Strong's controlled performance. Blackwood rarely needs extravagant movement because his entire appearance is constructed to make him seem certain of his power. His connection to occult rituals allows the costume and production departments to introduce ceremonial imagery that differs from ordinary Victorian clothing. Robes, symbols, dark chambers, and formal arrangements make his followers appear connected to something ancient and secret. These visual choices are essential to Blackwood's strategy because his power depends on spectacle. The sets develop the same themes on a much larger scale. Baker Street is one of the most important environments because it functions as a physical representation of Holmes's mind. The rooms are crowded with books, papers, chemicals, scientific equipment, weapons, furniture, personal objects, and unfinished experiments. The apparent disorder tells the audience something important. Holmes does not require conventional organization to understand his environment. What looks chaotic to Watson or Mrs. Hudson may still make perfect sense to him. The apartment, therefore, becomes a visual map of a brain that is constantly moving from one problem to another. Baker Street also represents Holmes and Watson's shared life. It is not simply an office where cases are discussed. It is the place where their routines, arguments, experiments, and friendship have developed. Watson's decision to move out consequently gives the set emotional importance. Holmes is not merely losing a roommate. The familiar structure of his life is being dismantled. The London streets offer a dramatic contrast to the intimacy of Baker Street. They are crowded and frequently dirty, filled with carts, pedestrians, smoke, brickwork, businesses, construction, and industrial activity. The production avoids presenting Victorian London as a perfectly preserved historical attraction. Instead, the city feels unfinished. Buildings are being constructed, machines are operating, and old neighborhoods exist beside major engineering projects. This supports the story's fascination with a society moving toward modernity. Industrial locations are especially significant. Shipyards, factories, laboratories, underground spaces, and mechanical environments dominate many action sequences. These settings allow the film to combine historical architecture with enormous machines and dangerous physical structures. Riordan's laboratory is particularly important because it begins revealing the scientific foundation beneath Blackwood's supposed magic. Chemicals, equipment, notes, and experiments replace the supernatural imagery surrounding the villain. Production design therefore participates directly in the mystery. The audience can literally see the transition from ritual to science. Sherlock Holmes depends heavily on dialogue because its central character is defined as much by language as by physical action. The screenplay, credited to Michael Robert Johnson, Anthony Peckham, and Simon Kinberg, had to make an extremely intelligent detective entertaining without allowing his explanations to become endless lectures. The solution was to combine rapid deduction, dry humor, arguments, exposition, and character conflict. Conversations rarely exist for only one purpose. A scene may explain part of the mystery while simultaneously revealing Holmes's arrogance, Watson's frustration, Irene's deception, or Blackwood's psychological control. The most distinctive dialogue belongs to Holmes and Watson. Their conversations establish immediately that they have known each other for a long time. They do not speak like a detective giving instructions to an assistant. They interrupt, criticize, challenge, and provoke one another. Watson understands Holmes too well to be impressed by every display of intelligence, while Holmes knows exactly how to irritate Watson when he wants a reaction. This creates the film's central comic rhythm. Holmes may begin discussing evidence and suddenly make a personal observation. Watson may attempt to maintain seriousness before losing patience. Their conversations frequently accelerate until they resemble verbal fights. The comedy comes from familiarity rather than simple jokes. The screenplay uses this relationship to modernize the characters without filling their dialogue with obviously contemporary expressions. Their emotional rhythm feels modern even when the setting remains Victorian. They behave like two longtime friends who have accumulated years of unresolved arguments. This makes them accessible to audiences who may know nothing about Conan Doyle's stories. One of the best examples occurs when Watson introduces Holmes to Mary Morstan. Holmes initially promises to behave appropriately, but his powers of observation quickly become socially destructive. Mary challenges him to analyze her, and Holmes accepts. What begins as entertainment becomes uncomfortable when he identifies personal details she would rather not discuss. The scene is important because it demonstrates both Holmes's brilliance and his weakness. The deductions themselves are impressive, but Holmes fails to understand when intelligence should be restrained. The script therefore turns exposition into characterization. The audience learns how his method works while simultaneously seeing why Watson finds living with him exhausting. Holmes's dialogue often has a rapid analytical structure. He observes one detail, connects it to another, eliminates alternatives, and reaches a conclusion before the other characters have processed the first observation. Robert Downey Jr.'s fast delivery strengthens the effect. Holmes sounds like someone whose speech is struggling to keep pace with his thoughts. However, the screenplay avoids making him permanently dominant. Watson, Irene, Mary, and Blackwood each challenge him differently. Watson attacks his habits and emotional immaturity. Mary exposes his lack of social restraint. Irene manipulates his curiosity. Blackwood attempts to create something Holmes cannot rationally explain. Irene's dialogue is particularly important because her scenes with Holmes are based on concealment. Almost every conversation contains information that one character is deliberately withholding. Their attraction is expressed through competition rather than conventional romantic declarations. Irene understands that curiosity is one of Holmes's greatest weaknesses. If she gives him a mystery, he will follow it even when he knows he is being manipulated. Their conversations therefore operate like negotiations. Holmes attempts to discover who employs her, while Irene provides only enough information to keep him interested. Blackwood uses language differently. His dialogue is slower, more ceremonial, and deliberately threatening. He wants people to believe that he possesses knowledge beyond ordinary human understanding. When he speaks to Holmes before his execution, he does not attempt to escape or plead for his life. Instead, he predicts future deaths and suggests that his hanging will begin something larger. This conversation establishes tension because Holmes cannot immediately determine how Blackwood intends to fulfill the prophecy. Blackwood uses uncertainty as a weapon. His words become dangerous before any new crime has occurred. The contrast between Holmes and Blackwood is therefore reflected in their speech. Holmes uses language to break complicated things into logical pieces. Blackwood uses language to make understandable things appear mysterious. Holmes explains. Blackwood obscures. Exposition presents one of the screenplay's greatest challenges. The plot contains ritual murders, chemical experiments, a secret society, political conspiracy, apparent resurrection, hidden technology, and Moriarty's manipulation. Considerable information must eventually be communicated to the audience. The script attempts to distribute this information across investigations rather than saving everything for one final conversation. Holmes discovers laboratories, examines bodies, follows symbols, questions suspects, and studies physical evidence. Each scene provides another piece of the explanation. Nevertheless, the final act requires Holmes to explain how Blackwood's supposed miracles were achieved. This is a traditional feature of detective storytelling. The pleasure comes partly from watching disconnected clues become a coherent sequence. The screenplay therefore allows Holmes to reconstruct earlier events after the audience has already witnessed their apparently supernatural versions. The difference between what the audience first sees and what Holmes later explains is essential. A death that initially resembles magic becomes chemistry or engineering. The dialogue changes the meaning of previous images. This makes explanation itself part of the climax. The marketing campaign for Sherlock Holmes faced an unusual challenge. Sherlock Holmes was already one of the most famous fictional characters in the world, so the filmmakers did not need to explain who he was. Instead, the campaign needed to convince audiences that this particular Sherlock Holmes was different. Warner Brothers therefore promoted the movie not simply as another literary adaptation, but as a large-scale action-adventure built around Robert Downey Jr., Jude Law, mystery, comedy, danger, and a dramatically reinvented Victorian London. Robert Downey Jr. became the most important element of the campaign. His career had recently experienced an extraordinary resurgence following Iron Man in 2008, and audiences now associated him with charismatic, intelligent, sarcastic characters. Advertising for Sherlock Holmes took advantage of that popularity. Downey was positioned prominently on posters and promotional material, making his interpretation of Holmes one of the film's primary attractions. Jude Law was promoted almost as strongly. This was important because the filmmakers wanted audiences to understand that Watson would not be a passive assistant. Posters frequently placed Holmes and Watson together, presenting the movie as a partnership rather than a story about one brilliant detective surrounded by secondary characters. Their contrasting appearances communicated their personalities immediately. Holmes looked more eccentric and unpredictable, while Watson appeared controlled and respectable. Rachel McAdams and Mark Strong expanded the campaign's appeal. McAdams brought recognition from successful romantic films, comedies, and thrillers, while Strong represented the darker side of the story through Lord Blackwood. Promotional images involving Blackwood emphasized mystery and danger without fully explaining whether the supernatural threat was genuine. The theatrical trailers were particularly important in establishing tone. Rather than opening with a slow explanation of Sherlock Holmes' mythology, the advertising emphasized speed. Audiences saw fights, explosions, investigations, London streets, unusual machinery, romantic tension, humor, and rapid exchanges between Holmes and Watson. The trailers also highlighted Holmes's physical abilities. This immediately distinguished the film from the popular stereotype of the detective as someone who remains safely beside a fireplace while solving mysteries through conversation. Scenes of Downey boxing, fighting criminals, escaping explosions, and moving through industrial environments announced that Guy Ritchie's interpretation would operate partly as an action hero. However, the campaign could not remove deduction without losing the identity of Sherlock Holmes. Advertising therefore included moments in which Holmes rapidly observed people or predicted physical actions. This allowed the marketing to sell spectacle while reassuring audiences that intelligence remained the character's defining weapon. Humor was another major promotional tool. The exchanges between Downey and Law helped prevent the film from appearing excessively dark. Trailers showed Watson becoming frustrated with Holmes, Holmes behaving badly in social situations, and the two men arguing while facing dangerous circumstances. Their chemistry became one of the clearest reasons to see the movie. Irene Adler added romantic and sexual tension to the campaign. Promotional material emphasized that she was one of the few people capable of unsettling Holmes. Her presence also helped communicate that the story involved deception and emotional vulnerability rather than only investigation and fighting. The visual identity of the posters reflected the movie's combination of period drama and modern action. Character portraits were often placed against smoky, industrial backgrounds filled with Victorian architecture. Dark metallic tones, gray skies, brown textures, and dramatic lighting connected the advertising directly to the film's production design. The title itself carried enormous marketing value. Sherlock Holmes required little explanation in international markets because the name had been established through more than a century of stories and adaptations. Warner Brothers could therefore focus promotional material on the new interpretation rather than introducing the basic concept. Guy Ritchie's name also contributed to the campaign. Audiences familiar with Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, Snatch, and Rock'n'Roller associated him with fast editing, criminal characters, dark humor, and energetic British storytelling. Promoting a Sherlock Holmes movie directed by Ritchie immediately suggested that this would not be a conservative adaptation. The release date was another major part of the commercial strategy. Sherlock Holmes opened on Christmas Day in the United States in 2009. The holiday period offered access to large audiences but also placed the film in an extremely competitive marketplace. Avatar had opened only 1 week earlier and was rapidly becoming a global phenomenon. Despite that competition, Sherlock Holmes performed strongly. Its ability to attract audiences alongside one of the largest cinematic events of the era demonstrated the effectiveness of the campaign and the commercial strength of the Holmes name combined with Downey's growing star power. Television advertising concentrated heavily on action and humor because short commercials needed to communicate the film's personality quickly. Explosions, fights, Blackwood's threatening presence, Irene's relationship with Holmes, and Watson's frustration could all be understood without explaining the complicated conspiracy. Interviews and press appearances strengthened the focus on the actors. Downey and Law's chemistry during promotion reflected the relationship audiences would see on screen. Their friendship and humorous interactions made it easier to market Holmes and Watson as a duo. The actors themselves effectively became extensions of the campaign. The mystery surrounding Blackwood was handled carefully. Sherlock Holmes stands apart from many earlier adaptations because Guy Ritchie approaches Arthur Conan Doyle's detective through the language of modern action cinema. The essential characters, Victorian setting, Baker Street address, Scotland Yard connections, scientific interests, disguises, and partnership between Holmes and Watson remain recognizable. What changes dramatically is the rhythm. The 2009 film is faster, more physical, more humorous, and more interested in large-scale spectacle than the restrained detective atmosphere associated with many previous screen interpretations. One of the most useful comparisons is with the Sherlock Holmes films starring Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. Beginning with The Hound of the Baskervilles in 1939, Rathbone became one of the most influential screen versions of Holmes. His sharp appearance, controlled delivery, confidence, and intellectual authority helped define the popular image of the detective for generations. Robert Downey Jr. deliberately moves away from that image. His Holmes is less polished and more unpredictable. He can appear untidy, bored, antisocial, physically restless, and emotionally immature. Instead of always projecting complete control, Downey allows audiences to see the personal disorder surrounding Holmes's extraordinary intelligence. The difference becomes even clearer when comparing the two versions of Watson. Nigel Bruce's Watson became famous for warmth and loyalty, but his interpretation was frequently more confused and comic than Conan Doyle's original military doctor. Jude Law's Watson rejects that tradition almost completely. Law presents Watson as an experienced soldier, capable doctor, marksman, and fighter. He does not simply watch Holmes confront danger. He participates. He also challenges Holmes intellectually and emotionally, making their partnership more balanced. In this respect, Ritchie's film can actually be seen as restoring qualities from Conan Doyle that popular stereotypes had gradually weakened. Another important comparison is with The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, directed by Billy Wilder in 1970. Wilder's film explores Holmes as an emotionally complicated and lonely individual rather than merely an infallible reasoning machine. Ritchie's version is far more action-oriented, but both films are interested in what happens when Holmes's extraordinary intelligence fails to make ordinary human relationships simple. The 1985 film Young Sherlock Holmes provides another useful comparison. That movie combines Holmes with large-scale adventure, elaborate visual effects, secret rituals, apparent supernatural events, and an explanation that ultimately reconnects extraordinary experiences with rational causes. The similarities demonstrate that the idea of placing Holmes inside more spectacular adventure cinema existed before 2009. However, Ritchie's film pushes that approach further by incorporating the pacing and visual grammar of 21st-century action movies. Explosions, industrial environments, rapid editing, slow motion, physical combat, and digital reconstruction give the film a scale closer to a modern franchise blockbuster than a traditional mystery. The movie can also be compared with Ritchie's earlier work. Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatch are contemporary crime films rather than Victorian mysteries, yet several directorial characteristics carry into Sherlock Holmes. Ritchie enjoys complicated plots, eccentric personalities, criminal environments, dark humor, rapid conversations, unusual editing, and stories in which separate pieces eventually connect. The difference is scale. Sherlock Holmes gave Ritchie access to a major studio production, elaborate historical environments, visual effects, large action sequences, and an internationally recognized character. His filmmaking personality therefore had to operate within a much larger commercial framework. Ritchie's use of changing camera speeds is especially significant. Holmes's calculated fights slow time, while he predicts exactly how he will injure an opponent. The action then accelerates when he executes the plan. This technique combines Ritchie's interest in stylized violence with a defining characteristic of Holmes: analysis. Compared with conventional action heroes, Holmes is therefore unusual. James Bond, Indiana Jones, or Jason Bourne may use intelligence during dangerous situations, but physical capability is central to their identities from the beginning. Holmes comes from detective fiction, where observation and reasoning traditionally dominate. The 2009 film solves this difference by making deduction the foundation of physical action. Holmes does not simply punch more effectively than his opponent. He identifies anatomical weaknesses, predicts reactions, and calculates consequences. Fighting becomes another puzzle. The film also shares characteristics with the superhero revival of its era. Batman Begins and The Dark Knight had demonstrated the commercial potential of taking a famous character and rebuilding the surrounding mythology through contemporary cinematic techniques. Iron Man had transformed Robert Downey Jr. into a major franchise star only 1 year before Sherlock Holmes. Downey's Tony Stark and Sherlock Holmes inevitably invite comparison. Both are exceptionally intelligent men with sarcastic personalities, unusual habits, self-destructive tendencies, and difficulty maintaining ordinary relationships. Downey uses his ability to deliver rapid dialogue in both roles. However, the performances are not identical. Stark enjoys public attention and builds much of his identity around celebrity. Holmes is far more isolated. Stark creates futuristic technology, while Holmes operates within the scientific possibilities and limitations of Victorian society. Holmes also seems less interested in wealth or social approval. The film can also be compared with Christopher Nolan's Batman movies in its treatment of a familiar icon. Both approaches remove some of the cleaner qualities associated with older popular versions and place their heroes inside heavily textured environments. Yet Sherlock Holmes is considerably more comic. Holmes and Watson's constant arguments prevent the atmosphere from becoming relentlessly serious.